A man named Tertius sits at a low wooden table in a house in Corinth in the winter of the year 57. He is holding a reed pen. His hand is already cramping. Across the room, a shorter man with a scarred back and a restless walk is pacing, dictating faster than Tertius can write, stopping only to let the ink catch up. That pacing man is Paul, and the letter he is dictating will outlive every empire that ever tried to silence him. Paul is not in prison yet. That comes later. Right now, he is simply a man far from home, staying in the house of a believer named Gaius, trying to say something to a church he has never even visited, a church in Rome, a city he has never seen with his own eyes. He does not know if this letter will survive the journey. He doesn't know if the church in Rome will even read it aloud or quietly set it aside. And somewhere in the middle of that letter, dictated in a rented room to a scribe whose name almost got lost to history, he says one sentence that will get quoted at funerals, tattooed on wrists, and printed on coffee mugs for the next 2,000 years. You have heard it, maybe stitched onto a pillow in your grandmother's house, maybe whispered to you by someone trying to comfort you after the worst phone call of your life. Maybe you have said it to someone else, standing in a hospital hallway, not fully sure you believed it yourself in that moment. All things work together for good. Here is what almost nobody tells you. That sentence contains a word, one single Greek word, that you use yourself. Maybe this week, in a meeting, on a group text, in a sentence about your job, your team, your family. English speakers use this word constantly, and almost none of them know it came from a persecuted man dictating a letter in a rented room in Greece 20 centuries ago. We will get to that word, but not yet. This is not a verse about everything happening for a reason. This is not a promise that pain is secretly good if you just squint hard enough to see it. This is not a magic phrase that makes suffering disappear the moment you say it with enough faith. This is something far stranger and far more precise than the version most people have been handed on a bookmark. Paul was not a theorist writing from the safety of a library. By the time he dictated this line, he had already been beaten with rods more than once, stoned and left for dead outside a city gate, shipwrecked at sea for a night and a day, and hunted by his own former religious tribe, the same tribe he used to belong to, the same laws he used to enforce with his own hands. He was not writing poetry from a comfortable chair with warm tea beside him. He was writing from inside a life that had, by every visible measure, fallen apart more than once. And he still wrote it down. He still believed it was true enough to put his name on. That should tell you something before you even get to the Greek grammar underneath it. So, if you are holding this verse right now, maybe someone handed it to you recently. Maybe you are the one who needs it. Stay with me, because the actual grammar of this sentence is about to change how you read your own worst season. The Greek word sitting underneath work together is synergei, synergei. It comes from two smaller words fused into one, syn, meaning together, and ergon, meaning work. Put them side by side and you get something closer to co-labors than coincidentally lines up. Paul is not saying that random events happen to arrange themselves into good outcomes, the way a shuffled deck occasionally lands in order by chance, the odds simply falling your way. He is saying something is actively laboring, working, on purpose, alongside other things, alongside your circumstances, alongside your worst decisions and other people's worst decisions, toward a result you cannot yet see from where you are standing. Here's what most people miss. Paul had already lived a version of this sentence long before he wrote it down himself, because his entire Bible, The Hebrew scriptures he had memorized as a boy in a synagogue school, repeated aloud until they were part of him, was built around one story that proved it first, centuries before Romans was ever dictated. You know the name Joseph. What you may not know is how young he was when it started. 17 years old, favored by his father, hated by his own brothers for it, thrown into a dry cistern in the wilderness and sold to a caravan of Ishmaelite traders for the price of a slave. 17. You can picture it if you try. The rope around his wrists, his own brothers standing above the pit, splitting the silver between them while he screamed up at faces he had trusted his whole life, faces that shared his own blood, dragged in chains to Egypt, sold again to a man named Potiphar, falsely accused by that man's wife, thrown into a prison he had done absolutely nothing to deserve, with no trial, no lawyer, no timeline for release. Years pass. Not weeks. Years. If you had asked Joseph, chained in an Egyptian dungeon at 20 years old, with no visitors and no explanation, whether all things were working together for good, you can imagine what his honest answer would have been in that moment. And then, famine. Not a small inconvenience you could wait out. A regional catastrophe. The kind that kills entire populations across multiple countries over several years. Joseph's own family, the very brothers who sold him into slavery, walk into Egypt starving, bowing to a foreign official they do not recognize, and find their brother standing in the throne room dressed like a prince, holding their lives in his hands. He could have executed them on the spot. He had the power, and by any reasonable standard of justice, the right. Instead, he says one of the most stunning sentences in the entire Hebrew Bible. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Not, it worked out fine in the end. Not, everything happens for a reason, so don't worry about it. Two separate wills operating inside the very same event. Human evil, meaning one thing. God working alongside it toward another, without erasing the evil or pretending it never happened. That is synergei in action, roughly 400 years before Paul ever had a Greek word to describe it. But it gets stranger. Job never got that kind of explanation. Not once, not even at the very end. Job lost his children in a single afternoon, 10 of them, crushed under a collapsing house while they feasted together and laughed, with no warning at all. He lost his flocks, his servants, his health, sitting afterward in ashes scraping his own skin with a piece of broken pottery. His so-called friends sitting beside him, telling him it must somehow, secretly be his own fault. And Job never got a Joseph moment. He never got the throne room reveal, the tidy explanation, the brothers walking in humbled and afraid, asking forgiveness. God restores him, eventually, after chapters of silence. But the book never actually tells Job why the disaster happened at all. Not once. Not even in the closing chapters. Grief, in Job's story, does not get resolved with an answer. It gets outlasted instead. You may already know exactly what that feels like, if you are honest with yourself tonight. And then there is Ruth, a widow, a foreigner from Moab, with no husband, no children, no land, and no legal standing whatsoever in the country she walked into, out of loyalty to a woman even more broken than she was. Ruth gleaned leftover grain behind harvesters just to eat, bent over in someone else's field from dawn until the heat forced her to stop for the day, her back aching, her hands raw. That is not romance. That is survival, day by exhausting day, with no guarantee of tomorrow's meal. And it is precisely inside that survival, a childless widow picking up scraps she was legally allowed to keep only because of an ancient mercy law written centuries earlier, that God is quietly working a foreign woman's story into the bloodline of King David, and eventually into the bloodline of Jesus himself. Ruth had no idea any of that was happening while she worked. She was just trying to get through the harvest season alive, one day at a time. 3 stories. 3 completely different outcomes. Joseph got an explanation, decades later, in a throne room he never saw coming as a teenager in that cistern. Job got silence and had to learn how to live inside it without ever getting his questions answered. Ruth got a future she never lived to see unfold, a legacy she could not have imagined while gleaning barley in the dirt of somebody else's field. And in every single one of these stories, something was synergizing underneath the visible events, working together, laboring alongside human choices and human suffering alike, without ever asking permission first, and without ever explaining itself on anyone's timeline but its own. If a video like this is helping you actually understand your Bible instead of just quoting it at other people, that is exactly what this channel exists for. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you when you need it. Now, there is one more thing Paul does with this verse, buried in the manuscripts themselves, that most translations completely hide from you. And it changes who this promise is actually about. Here's the part nobody tells you. Some of the oldest surviving Greek manuscripts of Romans, the ones scholars weigh most heavily when they reconstruct the original text. Manuscripts older than most of the cathedrals you have ever walked into do not simply say all things work together. They include one more word, ho theos, God. Not all things work together for good, as some vague cosmic mechanism humming along quietly in the background of your life, but God works all things together for good, with God named directly as the one doing the laboring. That is not a small textual footnote you can skip past on your way to the next verse. That changes who or what this verse is actually about. It is not a promise about the universe having good instincts, or karma quietly balancing itself out somewhere behind the scenes. It is a promise about a person actively working, with your specific name attached to the sentence whether you feel it today or not. The 4th century preacher John Chrysostom, a man whose sermons on Romans still survive nearly 1700 years later, whose nickname literally meant golden mouth because of how he spoke to packed crowds in Constantinople, sometimes for hours at a time, argued that Paul picked this word on purpose. Not all things happen for good, as if by accident, the way you might stumble into a parking spot right in front of the door. Work together for good, as an act of deliberate will. Chrysostom preached that the word implies cooperation between things that do not naturally belong together. Grief and hope, evil intentions and hidden purpose, famine and rescue, your worst decision, and someone else's mercy, being pulled on purpose into the same current, toward the same shore, even when those things look nothing alike sitting side by side. Now, watch what happens when the stakes stop being personal and start being national. Esther is a Jewish orphan, raised by her older cousin Mordecai, living under Persian rule, hiding her ethnicity just to survive inside a foreign palace where one wrong word, one careless slip in conversation could cost her everything she had built. When a powerful official named Haman convinces the king to authorize the extermination of every Jew in the empire, Esther is not facing a personal inconvenience you could simply shrug off and move past. She is facing the erasure of an entire people, herself included, her own cousin included, everyone she has ever loved included, an entire ethnicity wiped from a map by royal decree. Mordecai sends her a message that should stop you cold if you read it slowly, without rushing past it. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Not, I'm sure it will work out, don't worry about it. Who knows? Even Mordecai, the man who raised her from childhood, does not have the ending yet. He is asking her to risk her own life without a single guarantee attached. This is not a story about a queen getting lucky at exactly the right moment. This is not a story about good timing landing in her favor, purely by chance. This is not a story about a woman who simply kept her composure under pressure and happened to charm the right person in the right room. This is a story about an entire nation's survival, hanging on one person's willingness to risk death. Esther walking uninvited into the king's inner court, where the penalty for approaching without a summons was execution on the spot. No exceptions, no appeals. Saying words that still echo through synagogues today, read aloud once a year without fail. If I perish, I perish. Personal stakes with Joseph, sold by his own family. Family stakes with Ruth, a widow with nothing but loyalty to hold onto. Now national stakes with Esther, an entire people hanging on one decision. You can feel the pattern escalating with each story Paul would have grown up hearing, memorized by heart, in a synagogue school as a boy, long before he ever picked up, or rather dictated, his own pen in that rented room in Corinth, borrowing language his listeners would have already known by heart. Here's what most people miss about Paul himself, the man who wrote this whole sentence in the first place, dictating it in that rented room. He did not write this verse from a place of resolved suffering, looking back on hardship from a safe distance, the way you might tell an old story once the danger is past. He wrote it while still carrying something unresolved, something he never got fixed in his own lifetime, something that stayed with him until the day he died. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul describes what he calls a thorn in the flesh. Scholars still debate exactly what it was, a physical ailment, damaged eyesight from his encounter on the road to Damascus, chronic pain that never left him. We are simply not entirely sure. And Paul himself never spells it out for you in plain terms. What we do know is that Paul asked God 3 separate times to remove it. 3 times, specifically, deliberately, on his knees, pleading. And God did not remove it. The answer Paul received instead was not removal. It was this: my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul lived the rest of his life with that thorn still in place, still there, still unresolved, still uncomfortable every single day. He never got the Joseph ending, the throne room, the dramatic reversal, the brothers bowing in shame and relief while he watches from a place of power. He got something closer to Job's ending instead, unexplained, unresolved. And he wrote, all things work together for good anyway. From inside that exact tension, not after escaping it, not from the other side of it looking back. That is where the hidden word finally surfaces, the one promised back at the very beginning of this video. The Greek synergei, work together, is the direct ancestor of a word you have used yourself, maybe this very week, without a second thought about where it came from. Synergy. 2 departments combining strengths in a conference room you have probably sat in. 2 athletes clicking on the field in a way neither one could produce alone, no matter how talented either was individually. 2 chemicals reacting to produce something stronger than either one could manage on its own. Every single time someone in a boardroom says the word synergy, they are, without knowing it, quoting the exact language Paul used 2,000 years ago to describe how God works pain and grace into a single outcome. The word survived every century between his rented room in Corinth and your last team meeting this month. Most people using it have absolutely no idea where it came from, and would probably be surprised to learn it was Paul's word first. Picture a parent in a hospital waiting room. Not the movie version with soft lighting and a swelling soundtrack building in the background. The real one. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead without mercy. A phone sitting at 3% battery because nobody thought to bring a charger. A surgeon's time estimate that keeps sliding later and later with every single update. None of the individual pieces in that room look like anything good, if you are being fully honest with yourself in that chair. The diagnosis does not look good. The waiting does not look good. The silence from the nurse's station does not look good. But synergy was never a claim that each individual piece is good on its own, sitting there, in isolation. It is a claim that something is actively, deliberately working those pieces together. The diagnosis and the decision and the unbearable waiting toward an outcome that parent in that plastic chair cannot yet see from where they are sitting right now. Joseph could not see it from the bottom of the cistern. Job never fully saw it, not even by the final chapter of his own book. Paul carried his thorn all the way to the end of his life without ever seeing it removed, without ever getting the answer he asked for 3 times. And still, synergy. Still working, still together. Still somehow toward good, even when good is nowhere in sight yet from where you happen to be standing. That does not mean every hospital room ends in healing, and you should not let anyone tell you that it does, because that would be a lie dressed up as comfort. It does not mean every job ends in restoration in this life. Some genuinely do not, and pretending otherwise helps no one. Paul never promised that outcome, and neither will this video, because that would be a smaller and cheaper promise than the one actually sitting inside the Greek word itself. What the word promises is narrower and somehow sturdier for exactly that reason, that nothing you are carrying right now is unattended. Nothing is being wasted in isolation, off in some corner where no one is paying attention to it. Something is laboring alongside it, alongside you, whether or not you can feel that labor happening today. 3 things to carry with you out of this video. First, all things work together for good is not a claim that everything is good. It is a claim that something is actively working on purpose alongside everything, including the parts of your life that are not good at all right now. That is the truth of the word underneath every English translation you have ever read. Second, and this one is personal, that promise was written by a man who never got his own thorn removed while he was alive, which means you do not need a resolved ending, a tidy explanation, or a throne room reveal in order to trust the sentence. Paul didn't have one either when he wrote it down. Third, and this is the one that should stay with you tonight after you close this video. The word synergy, the one you have used casually in meetings and group chats and performance reviews without a second thought, is a fossil of a persecuted man's confidence that God does not abandon people to their worst chapter. He labors inside it, alongside you, whether or not you can feel it yet. Which story hit you the hardest tonight? Joseph in the cistern, Job in the ashes, Ruth in the field, or Paul carrying a thorn he never got to put down? Tell me below which one. I read every single comment. Some things get explained eventually, like Joseph's. Some things get outlasted instead, like Job's. And some things, like Paul's own thorn, never get explained at all in this lifetime. And God works together with them anyway, whether you ever get the explanation or not.